January 17, 1914. A cold wind moves across the wooden porches of a small Midwestern town. The streets are quiet except for the slow rattle of a horse-drawn wagon rolling past the general store. A newspaper boy, barely 12, shouts headlines about troubles in Europe, but few stop to buy a copy. Most Americans believe the storm gathering across the Atlantic is distant, a problem belonging to old kingdoms and old grudges. The United States feels insulated behind oceans, farms, factories, and the rhythm of ordinary life. Yet within 4 years, that rhythm will change forever. The war will reach into kitchens, factories, schools, and hearts, reshaping daily life in ways no one imagined on this cold January morning. The air smells of coal smoke drifting from chimneys. Women step out of houses carrying metal pails to fetch water from backyard pumps. Plumbing is still a luxury in many American homes. Children bundled in wool coats play stickball beside wooden fences. A man in a felt hat opens the door of the local barber shop where the talk is the same as always. Weather, crops, wages, the price of flour. But attention hides in the background. Across the ocean, gunfire has already begun, and cables from Europe arrive each morning describing battles that grow closer to catastrophe. For now, America watches and waits. The stillness before the storm hangs in the winter air, hinting at the vast changes ahead. Before the United States entered the war, the nation tried to maintain neutrality, a stance President Woodrow Wilson defended repeatedly. But neutrality could not shield America from the ripple effects of global conflict. American newspapers published chilling accounts from Belgium describing the destruction of villages and the displacement of civilians. Wall Street tracked the volatility of European markets as governments scrambled to finance their armies. And coastal cities watched the seas nervously, aware that German U-boats patrolled the Atlantic. Even the simplest aspects of daily life, shopping, farming, traveling, would begin to feel the distant tremors of a war that was steadily reshaping the world. Factories in cities like Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Detroit buzzed with activity as orders for steel, coal, and machinery soared. Production that once served domestic markets now flowed toward Europe. The demand created jobs, but it also exposed deep inequalities. Industrial workers labored long hours under tough conditions, their factories hot, loud, and crowded. The wages were modest, yet many accepted the hardship because the war economy brought more opportunity than they had seen in years. For immigrants, especially those arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe, the promise of steady work outweighed the dangers of industrial labor. Their days began before sunrise and ended with the shrill whistle of factory shifts, the streets filled with tired faces heading home to cramped tenement buildings. The routine was grueling, but for many, it opened a doorway into the American dream. In rural America, life retained its slower, older rhythm. Farmers relied on horses, hand tools, and community labor. Tractors existed, but they were expensive and rare. Most agricultural work depended on muscle and endurance. Families rose before dawn to milk cows, feed livestock, and haul water from wells. Fields stretched across the horizon, divided by weathered fences and dirt roads. Children played roles in the household economy, gathering eggs, tending small animals, or helping prepare meals. Churches and small-town gatherings shaped the social world. Yet even here, the influence of the war crept in. Crop prices changed each month, tied to European demand. Letters from relatives overseas brought uneasy news, and rural Americans debated whether the nation should remain neutral or intervene as the conflict deepened. Immigrant communities felt the tensions more directly. The United States in 1914 was home to millions of recent arrivals from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe. Germans were one of the largest groups, with vibrant cultural networks across cities and farming regions. They spoke their language openly, read German-language newspapers, and preserved traditions in festivals and churches. But as battles in Europe intensified, German Americans faced growing suspicion. Their daily life, once ordinary, began to change. Restaurants quietly removed German dishes from menus. Schools reconsidered German language programs. People avoided speaking their mother tongue too loudly in public. A sense of fear settled over communities that had thrived in peace, and this unease would only increase when the United States eventually entered the war. The outbreak of conflict in Europe also reshaped communication and information. News traveled through newspapers, telegraph cables, and letters. There were no televisions and few radios, so the printed word ruled. Families gathered around kitchen tables to read updates from the front, scanning headlines that mixed patriotism, horror, and speculation. Photographs arrived slowly and were often staged or carefully selected by governments. People learned of battles through maps drawn in black ink, arrows marking lines of advance and retreat across unfamiliar European landscapes. Rumors circulated in barber shops, factories, and markets. Some believed the war would be short. Others feared it would swallow entire nations. The lack of immediate information created a sense of distance, but also suspense, as Americans followed a conflict that felt both foreign and ominously relevant. Life in cities showcased a different rhythm from rural towns. Streets bustled with electric trolleys, early automobiles, street vendors, and crowds of workers. The smell of gasoline mixed with the scent of freshly baked bread drifting from corner bakeries. Children played on stoops of tall brick apartment buildings, their laughter echoing through alleyways. In New York, Chicago, and Boston, neighborhoods had distinct identities shaped by language, cuisine, and tradition. But city life also revealed contrasts. Grand theaters lit with bright bulbs stood only blocks away from tenements where families shared single rooms. Poverty and opportunity existed side by side in the vast urban landscape. And as the war progressed, cities would become hubs of propaganda, recruitment, and industrial expansion. For African Americans living in the South, daily life in 1914 followed a harsher pattern shaped by racial segregation and economic limitation. Jim Crow laws restricted freedoms, and opportunities were scarce. Sharecropping tied families to the land with little chance of advancement. But the war economy triggered a demographic shift that would become known as the Great Migration. Northern factories needed workers, and labor recruiters traveled south promising better wages and greater freedom. Word spread through churches, newspapers like the Chicago Defender, and letters from relatives who had already moved north. The decision to leave the South was difficult, but thousands packed their belongings into worn suitcases and boarded trains heading toward cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. Their journeys marked a profound turning point in African American life, reshaping communities and altering the cultural fabric of the nation. As these social currents flowed across the country, the war in Europe escalated. Reports described fighting in trenches filled with mud, rats, and constant danger. The introduction of poison gas shocked readers, its effects documented in disturbing detail by soldiers and medical staff. American newspapers printed eyewitness accounts from British and French correspondents who wrote about the daily misery of life on the front lines. These stories resonated deeply with families who imagined their sons in similar conditions should the United States ever join the conflict. The emotional weight of such reports shaped public opinion, blending fear, empathy, and moral outrage. The sinking of the RMS Lusitania in 1915 intensified America's emotional connection to the war. News of the ship's destruction spread rapidly, with headlines announcing the loss of American lives. Although the United States did not immediately enter the conflict, the event shifted the national mood. Public anger grew toward Germany, fueled by newspapers that described the attack as a violation of civilian safety. In small towns and large cities alike, people gathered around radios and newsstands to discuss the implications. Conversations that once focused on crops, wages, or local events now turned to strategies, alliances, and national responsibility. The war had become an unavoidable part of American life, even without direct involvement. Daily routines reflected this growing awareness. Schools taught lessons about geography, nationalism, and the significance of the European conflict. Churches prayed for peace and protection. Local clubs organized fundraising events to aid European civilians affected by the fighting. Women's groups sewed bandages, knitted socks, and collected supplies for relief organizations. These acts were small but meaningful, connecting ordinary Americans to distant suffering. The blending of compassion, patriotism, and anxiety created a new cultural rhythm across communities. Economics also began to shift. Prices for everyday goods fluctuated, driven by wartime demand. Flour, sugar, and meat became more expensive in many regions. Families adjusted their meals accordingly, stretching ingredients or substituting cheaper options. Cookbooks and household magazines offered creative recipes to cope with rising costs. In cities, food shortages occasionally sparked unrest as poor families struggled to keep up. The government monitored these trends carefully, aware that home front stability depended on access to necessities. Even before official involvement, America was experiencing the economic pressures of a global conflict. Meanwhile, the military remained small compared to European powers, but it continued to modernize. The U.S. Army began updating training manuals, studying trench warfare tactics, and preparing officers for potential involvement. Recruitment stations saw modest increases in volunteers, many inspired by a sense of duty or adventure. Military drills became more visible in public parks and fairgrounds. The image of the soldier, discipline, courage, sacrifice, returned to the forefront of national imagination. Young men read stories about European battles with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, unsure whether their own lives would soon follow similar paths. The Zimmerman telegram and the sinking of several American merchant ships finally pushed the nation past the tipping point. When the United States declared war in April 1917, the shift from observer to participant sent shockwaves across the nation. Daily life changed rapidly. Men lined up at recruitment stations or waited for their draft numbers to be called. Families gathered anxiously around newspapers, looking for updates about sons, brothers, and husbands heading to camps like Camp Funston, Camp Dix, and Camp Meade. These training grounds transformed from quiet fields into bustling military cities filled with tents, wooden barracks, and constant activity. For women, the war opened new roles. With so many men leaving for military service, women stepped into jobs previously closed to them. They worked in factories producing munitions, uniforms, and equipment. They operated streetcars, telephone switchboards, and clerical offices. In hospitals, they served as nurses, aides, and volunteers with organizations like the Red Cross. This shift reshaped gender expectations and expanded women's visibility in the workforce. Their contributions became essential to the war effort and changed the trajectory of women's rights in the decades to come. Propaganda became a central force in shaping daily behavior. Posters appeared on walls, lampposts, and storefronts urging Americans to enlist, conserve food, or buy Liberty bonds. Images used bold colors and powerful slogans to stir emotion and duty. Schools organized parades and patriotic programs. Newspapers printed speeches from government officials emphasizing unity and sacrifice. Civilian life became intertwined with military goals, and the boundaries between home and front blurred. Every household felt responsible for victory, whether through rationing, volunteer work, or financial support. Food conservation became a national priority. Government campaigns encouraged Americans to observe meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays. Posters urged households to save sugar, grow gardens, and limit waste. The idea of victory gardens spread quickly. Families planted vegetables in backyards, empty lots, and community spaces. Children learned basic farming skills, watering soil with tin cans, and proudly bringing home their first harvest. Home economics classes taught strategies for preserving food through canning and drying. This movement empowered ordinary people to feel directly connected to the national effort. In factories, production accelerated dramatically. Assembly lines operated day and night, producing rifles, helmets, boots, ships, and aircraft. The noise of machinery became a constant backdrop in industrial cities. Workers endured long shifts under strict schedules, but many accepted the hardship because they believed their labor supported soldiers overseas. Strikes occurred occasionally, especially in industries with poor working conditions, but the government used various tools to discourage labor disruption. Posters and speeches emphasized teamwork, unity, and responsibility, shaping public expectations about work and sacrifice. Life in towns near training camps changed dramatically as well. Small businesses grew rapidly, supplying goods and services to thousands of soldiers. Restaurants stayed open late to accommodate young men on weekend passes. Families hosted soldiers for home-cooked meals, offering a sense of comfort before deployment. The presence of military bands, marching drills, and transport convoys created a constant atmosphere of movement and anticipation. Communities felt both pride and anxiety as they watched trains depart carrying soldiers toward the unknown. Once American troops arrived in Europe, daily life at home shifted into a mixture of hope and fear. Families checked mailboxes each day for letters. Newspapers printed casualty lists, and people scanned them nervously. Communities held fundraisers, sent care packages, and attended prayer services. The emotional weight of war became part of every household, shaping conversations at dinner tables and gatherings. Near the end of the conflict, the influenza pandemic swept across the nation, intensifying hardships. Schools closed, public gatherings were restricted, and hospitals overflowed with patients. Masks became common in public spaces. This health crisis added a layer of fear and uncertainty to daily life, testing the resilience of communities already strained by war. Yet, people continued to support one another, relying on local networks and shared responsibility. When the armistice was signed in 1918, the country erupted in celebration. Bells rang, crowds filled streets, and soldiers returned home to embraces, tears, and parades. But daily life had changed permanently. Women had proven their capability in the workforce. African Americans had reshaped American cities through migration. Labor practices, government policies, and national identity had evolved. The war left physical and emotional scars, but it also accelerated progress and transformation across the country. In the quiet months after the war, households attempted to return to normal, but the old normal no longer existed. Families mourned lost loved ones. Communities rebuilt their rhythms. Veterans brought home memories that would never fade. America stepped into a new era shaped by industry, technology, and a broader vision of its role in the world. The world had changed, and so had daily life in the United States, shaped by the immense pressures and sacrifices of 4 tumultuous years. And from the cold morning of January 1914 to the hopeful dawn of 1919, the nation discovered that war reshapes not only armies and borders, but kitchens, classrooms, wages, friendships, identities, and the quiet heartbeat of everyday life.